Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Merritt, and I am the District's Equity Partner. Thank you so much for taking the time to observe our interviews today and to provide us with your feedback. Before we dig in, I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to submit questions and let you know that because of the volume of questions that we received, we will not be able to ask each and every question, but I did take the time to theme those questions and combine some of those questions, and we will ask as many, or I will ask as many as possible, given the 45-minute window that we have, and making space for Dr. Parker to respond in a way that allows him to fully answer the questions that you all have submitted. So we are going to get started. Welcome, Dr. Parker. Thank you for being with us this morning. Can we start off would you tell us a little bit about your professional background, and if you would tell us a little bit about why this position and why Shaker Heights?
Sure. Thank you, Erica, for having me here today. So a little bit about myself. I am originally from New Jersey, and I found my way here to Cleveland, Ohio through Case Western Reserve University. I am the Senior Associate Vice President for Equity at the university. My background and most of my time in higher education has dealt with diversity, inclusion, and equity. I started out with my bachelor's degree and master's degree in social work, which led me to do my internship as a school social worker in Syracuse, New York, at one of the most diverse elementary schools in the city that had a strong focus on international studies. And that was a great experience for me. And then I moved over into higher ed, where I was at Monmouth University in residence life, and then moved to Washington College, where I was able to work on improving diversity and inclusion at that institution, building an office from the ground up and working with faculty to change the culture at the institution. And then I was recruited to Case Western Reserve University to oversee the Title IX aspect and help with some of the equity inclusion aspects of the institution. Why Shaker Heights? I live in Shaker Heights, and my two sons are actually in Shaker Heights, and they love it. I've seen the great work that the schools have done with each of my sons, and I have actually been impressed by individuals who really truly want to see equity and diversity and inclusion flourish in Shaker Heights. This city has a lot of opportunity. It does have its challenges, but this position really opened my eyes that I feel like I can definitely contribute a lot, not only to the students, but as well as to teachers, parents, alumni, as well as the larger community of Shaker, because the school system cannot be as successful without the partners in the community. And I think that's critical. And I think this position lends us to that opportunity.
Thank you. So we are going to jump right into the questions shared with us by the community. And our first question is, what experience and practical strategies can you offer K-12 teachers to create more equitable lessons, equitable questioning techniques, and equitable strategies for working with parents? Actually, there's one more part. Equitable strategies for working with parents and a more equitable lens for delivering pedagogy. And I'm happy to repeat any part of that if you need.
So the one thing I think some of the strategies we can use is, first we need to see what is currently in place in the Shaker Heights City School System and really evaluate what is working and what is not, whether that is a SWOT analysis to see where the strengths, the challenges are, the opportunities that we can take advantage of. Some of the strategies, as I stated before, would be, look, working with the teachers to see if we can build a collaborative, and this would be with the chief academic officer as well, to look at, do we develop a center for teaching and learning for the teachers and administrators of Shaker Heights. By doing that, I believe that we can work on best practices and research around diversity and inclusion and identify some of those strategies. At the same time, I think it gives teachers more ownership of the curriculum, but it also helps people be really involved in this really important research. So some of those strategies would be possibly developing pedagogical workshops for the teachers in the system to focus on their identity as well and how that plays a critical role in their interactions with students, especially with parents. All of us have an identity with us and we can't ignore that. But having a Center for Teaching and Learning, I think, can provide us a lot of avenues to actually improve how some of these pedagogies are employed at the K through 12 level, especially through 9 through 12. We're an international baccalaureate school district. And I think we can be the best practice in Northeast Ohio or Ohio if we have something to that magnitude. And some of those strategies can just be simple of looking at, how do I express who I am to the students I am teaching? My background, understanding why am I incorporating different aspects of history, whether it's African American history, Latina history, Asian American history in it, because it all comes together at some point. And we need to understand that sometimes, and I give you this example because I was a part of a Teagle grant at Washington College, and we actually did survey faculty and teachers. And the one thing they actually said was they want to do the work of diversity and inclusion, but sometimes we don't provide the necessary tools to allow them to do that. So that's one strategy, teaching and learning center. Second piece, how is that structured? How are we going to fund it? Also, do we create smaller grants to help improve and encourage more teachers to be involved in how to diversify a curriculum? In terms of making sure with the parents, I think it's important that we meet individuals where they are. We cannot assume the burden that a parent needs to do X, Y, and Z. And that example I give is, we can't assume that one parent of a student should be doing the same thing as another parent of a student. We have to work with teachers as well as administrators to try to have conversations with parents one-on-one and listening, but also it's a two-way street. And we need to learn how to build that trust. So the one thing I said about when we went remote learning, access is an issue there because we can't assume that everyone has internet access. We can't assume that everyone has a computer. And Shaker Heights City School District did a really good job by providing the access by the laptops and hotspots. But the one strategy we can do is work with teachers and parents to have meetings to discuss the learning of their student. They already do that. But really get to know each other more than just your son or daughter is doing well and needs improvement in this area. How do we build that dialogue of saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, this is my background, and build that relationship there? And that's one strategy. The other strategy is, when we do back to school nights, which is a really great opportunity, do we do these things more often with our teachers and the parents to help the parents truly be partners in making sure their children are succeeding? Every parent wants their child to succeed. And one of those easy things to do is try to build that more of a deep relationship between the teacher, the student, as well as the parent.
Thank you. A director of equity and inclusion has to push us toward a world we've never seen, while bringing folks along who have different starting places. The path to success can feel quite narrow. What do you need from the community and leadership to create the space to have tough conversations that cannot be had without discomfort?
I would say that what I would need as a support from the community is just being comfortable with being uncomfortable. This is difficult work. We all have our own experiences. So what I need for the community to understand is each one of us has an experience and a story to tell. And it's important to listen. Sometimes, my great grandmother always said this to me, sometimes we think we're listening and we're not really listening. So we need to understand sometimes it's not always to give a quick response when someone's sharing their story. It's just to listen, process, and think, okay, there is some value to what this individual is telling, but it's also a value that they're trying to get me to understand where they are. So as a community, I think we need to be able to be uncomfortable, but understand it's for a greater good. Andre Lord mentioned this in her work. There is no hierarchy of oppression. We cannot address diversity and inclusion as my oppression is worse than your oppression, or judging someone based on how oppressed they are. We need to listen a little bit more. We need to also recognize the history of Shaker Heights and the Shaker Heights City School District. And the one thing I said to many people through this process is, how do we tell our story and how do we help others tell their story comfortably? And the way to do that is doing dialogue, not with only in the city, in the school district, but as well as the larger community. So as the executive director, I will be willing to work with the mayor, the council, to talk about how we can do these dialogues within each of our communities to start the process. But it doesn't only stop with dialogue. These dialogues have to result in action items that we all can agree on and work with. In this work, we're not always going to agree. But again, the ultimate goal is to have an inclusive environment and a safe environment for our students, teachers, administrators, parents, and alumni. And that includes the larger community as well. So being flexible, being able to listen, being able to acknowledge and reflect, and willing to take a chance is the things I think I will be looking for from the community and making sure we do this work correctly. But we also need to make sure that we have the information to make the right decisions.
Thank you. The next question: sexual misconduct among students creates significant barriers to equity and inclusion, especially but not solely for young women. From your experiences in post-secondary and or scholarly institutions, what would you say are your top 3 priorities for addressing this problem in Shaker?
Sure, that's a good question. I think the number one piece is education. Helping people understand what the district expectations are for respecting each other. The one thing we need to dismiss is that sexual assault is blaming the victim. It is not blaming the victim at all. We need to recognize to listen to people. So the top 3 issues is understanding what consent is. As I say, even in post-secondary education, we believe we know what consent is, but we do not. In today's age, K through 12 students have learned differently than what our parents have learned about sex and education during their time. And that definition has shifted. Technology is the one thing we need to get a better understanding of how our students are communicating with each other. And that's the big piece that we're missing. The third part is when we talk about equity, we have to look at what the recent regulations that just came out from the Department of Education. Yes, we've been hearing it talk about post-secondary education, but it also impacts primary and secondary. Because some of the rules that are in place need to ensure that parents who are going through the criminal system with their student are able to access the same resources that an individual who does have the means to do so. And I think it's our job to make sure that every student, whether they're a teacher, administrator, or parent, have the opportunity to have the resources needed to make sure that they're supported, but also we need to make sure that they understand that we care about them. And I'm gonna throw a fourth one in there, if you don't mind, Erica, of a top thing we need to start looking at is we need to start looking at more of making sure we're having these conversations with our children. And I think that's what the missing piece is. Looking at masculinity. And the one thing I tell my boys is okay to be vulnerable. They respecting women, respecting men, respecting other individuals is key to having a healthy relationship. Healthy relationships go along with understanding what we're talking about when we talk about issues of sexual misconduct. What does that look like? Intimate partner violence is really high among high school students, and we're starting to see that in middle school. And that's where we need to start talking to students about what are their expectations of being in a healthy relationship with someone. They do not have to ignore their needs and expectations just to make someone happy. And I think that's the key thing, communication and education and being as transparent and authentic is appropriate. Our students are, I think sometimes we underestimate what our students know. They know a lot more and they can handle a lot more, and we need to trust that.
In your experience, what is the most effective professional development strategy to disrupt the ongoing systemic / institutional racism in the pre-K-12 educational setting that addresses the implicit and explicit biases and lack of historical knowledge about the African American experience that many white teachers bring into classrooms and other interactions with Black students?
The strategy I just stated earlier was building a Center for Teaching and Learning. The research out there has actually supported that is where the learning begins, and the support and professional development opportunities present themselves for teachers. And the number one strategy is the curriculum. How's the curriculum delivered? You know, the one thing I did with my two sons was read one of the practice questions for the state exam. And I had to explain to him some of the language in there was a little concerning. But the way I explained it to him is I had to have a conversation with him about how being African American and he's biracial, how the terms that were used in that question, I had to go into a history lesson about this. And the one thing I appreciate about Shaker, one teacher my child had who is white actually took time out and actually explained to the entire class a history lesson about African American history based off of one of those test questions. So we really have to look at the curriculum. How is it written? Where is it coming from? How is it taught? Don't feel uncomfortable about addressing some of the hidden messages that is lying in the curriculum. This is what education is about. And that's one strategy. Look at the curriculum. Two, let's look at the environment. Each individual school's environment. And this is critical. And I know many people, if they read Beverly Tatum's book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together at the Table at Cafeteria? Here's one thing to look at. And she has some great strategies in there in looking. We need to look at how our students are interacting with each other in the classroom, in the lunchroom, and on the playground. And the same can be said for the teachers and the administrators, because how we learn in student development and learning, students learn about their environment. They're observant. So the one thing we need to do is look at how the environment is set up. If you walk in, and I've heard stories in Shaker that certain racial groups stick together, instead of ignoring it, Let's try to figure out why that is. And that is a strategy to look at. You're looking at the curriculum and also the environment in which the learning is taking place. And critical race theory really hits on that. And as a researcher in my dissertation work on research in this area, a lot of it is observational learning, but it's also digging deep to figure that out. Another strategy I would actually do, and I said this before, as the executive director, I would want to meet with the students and have lunch with them twice a month at different schools to hear their stories, to figure out what they're experiencing. Because the only way you can actually help change is not just by reading a bunch of data and surveys. You get that information, but I want to see how it's working in action. And I would do the same things with the teachers, and I would love to do once a month conversations with alum to keep them looped in and networking, because that is how I will be able to help make change in our district.
Thank you. As a candidate for this position, how do you see systematic change in the district through education, sociological, and administrative policies for minority students? And the example that's given is the quick placement of minority students into IEP programs or individual education plans.
So I think you have to start at evaluating the policies with fresh eyes, because we always have to look at the history and why policies were eventually implemented. And I think that is the one thing we don't do in society anymore, is recognize the history in which why this policy was put in place. So we need to look at what are the standards that are being used to place students in these classes, or even it's suggesting they need an IEP. And I'm gonna give you an example of something where in Syracuse, I actually had a student who, yeah, may have a behavioral issues, but he used it as a way to know that he can get out of music class. Like that. It was, and you know, and it took some time. And I took a step back and just observed. And I went, okay, the policy says here that if the student is disruptive, they need to automatically go to the social worker's office or the principal's office, right? But then I realized my office and my supervisor's office was set up with a lot of toys, Play-Doh and everything. So this student was thinking, I don't want to deal with this. So I'm going to cut up. But then that helped me realize we needed to look at that policy and train people on understanding what is truly a disruption. Helping teachers have the tools to have those difficult conversations in a culturally sensitive way. And that is one of the things we need to look at in those policies. The second piece is the track system. As we all know in history, track systems in the public school system was pretty much trying to ensure that certain students weren't interacting with other students, because we had that myth that this student would bring down my student's academic success, which we know that is a myth. So what we need to do is look at, we're not going to create these structured pathways for students. What we need to figure out is, what is the best learning model for our students? Because psychologically, telling a student, and I remember saying this to a colleague about 12 years ago, A track, B track, C track. You told these students they're in the C track. You told these students they're in the A track. A track was honors. What does that do psychologically to a student? We talk about imposter syndrome for adults in the professional world. Think about a African American or Latino or Latina student who is in an A track class, but then they're in C track classes for everything else. Then they start to think possibly, do I really belong in this track? We need to figure out, why are these tracks even needed? What are the needs of the student? But also the teachers do an excellent job, but we have to provide support for them and start looking at the best practices and not play it safe as a system. We need to be bold. We need to take action. And, I'm going to steal this from Case Western Reserve University. Think beyond the possible. That's what we have to do as a district, and making sure we're examining those policies. Our discrimination and harassment policies, we need to review that too. I need to look at numbers. How many individuals are bringing complaints forward? What is their racial background, their gender, religious, to see if there's a pattern. And are the policies actually clear enough for our faculty, students to understand, including parents? And then one thing is we have to make sure our policies are written in a way that an individual can read it. It has to be in layman's terms. Sometimes we get too legal. And then the other piece is too, and making sure we examine that, is we really need to examine what the state requires, and is it really in the best interest of the school district? I'm not saying ignore what is required, but we don't need to do the bare minimum. At the end of the day, if African American students or Latino students or even women are not enough of numbers in a science or STEM class, why is that? How can we recruit and encourage these students to feel that they belong and they can be equally successful in the STEM society? So it's always reviewing the policies with a fine-tooth comb. And the one thing I would actually do is meet with teachers, a group of students, an administrator, and parents, and say, you read this policy, tell me what you understand about it. And in my first 30 to 60 days, it's going to be a listening campaign to fully understand how all of these pieces are actually operating in our system.
A little trouble unmuting there. Thank you. All right, so our next question. Our diversity, equity, and inclusion work in Shaker is often centered on racial disparities. However, there are also income disparities that impact the student experience in our school system. Please address how socioeconomic disparities impact students and how teachers and staff can be trained to provide learning and services in a more equitable manner.
Sure. So I think the first thing we will have to do is recognize the economic impact in our area. And the one thing we have to look at is understanding that not every student has the means to have certain things. And the way we look at that is, for example, I was on the co-president of the PTO, and I learned that different schools are able to fund things differently. But understanding that every school has a fundraiser, and that fundraiser may not be as successful as the other school. So how do we make this equitable in providing services for people? So for example, the tutoring program. The one thing I heard in Shaker is not a lot of students are able to take advantage of that because of how far it is, transportation. So we need to look at how can we expand that program a little bit more to meet the needs of individuals who may not have a car, who parents may have to work, and they can't get their student to the tutoring center or any other program or activity. The other thing I think the teachers do very well is, and it's just something very small and many people may not recognize this, the birthday parties in the school. You have some kids who parents really can't afford to come in with cupcakes for their child. But at the same time, you have some parents that come in with a ton of things and family members to celebrate. And teachers have been really good from my observation of saying, we need to discuss paring this down so we don't have students feeling as though they are not able to have that same level of celebration, because that has an impact on a kid. If that happens at lunchtime, that kid will not be able to focus on their academics because of that socioeconomic piece that's lingering over their head. The lunch program is another key piece that we really need to look at. And this is something I advocate consistently for. Personally, for me, I think we should figure out a way to make sure we could provide lunch free for a good majority of our students within the district. Because the one thing we need to realize, and I understand there were rules and Shaker changed it, but a kindergarten first and second grader don't understand why they can't have lunch today if there's no money in their account. That's very hard to explain. High school, yes. Middle school, yes. So we need to be able to work together to figure out how can we equitably provide alternatives for students so they still feel that they matter and they care. And I do think we need to recognize too, different parts of Shaker is economically sound. And there are some other areas that are not. So the one thing we need to do is make sure we're including different areas into the entire planning of our equity process. So PTO meetings, parent-teacher nights. Sometimes parents may not be able to make it, right? But how do we get them to have that same experience? And teachers do that now. But we need to think more with COVID in place right now. It's not going to be that easy. The other piece about equity is I think we need to look at making sure helping teachers administer certain programs, academic services is we really need to look at being more prepared for anything. COVID hit, it really pushed even K through higher ed, K through 12 into an area of trying to figure out how do we provide these programs equitably to everyone. And that's where I think the Teaching and Learning Center comes into effect of helping teachers understand how to deliver this information in an equitable way. The other piece is looking at students with special needs and understanding that they should still have the same access as anyone other student who may not be on an IEP or anything else. Because sometimes we forget we still adhere to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. We cannot discriminate against these individual students, but it's our job to help teachers make sure and parents to provide the best services that they can to these individual areas. But also when we talk about socioeconomic status, it's language. We have to really focus on the language we use in the classroom and outside the classroom when we're explaining why someone may have something and the other person does not. And sometimes as adults, we're in the school buildings or just at events in the community and we forget our children are watching us or someone may overhear. So it's really understanding how we can be more sensitive and proactive in making sure that no matter what your social and economic status is, you still matter as a part of Shaker. And that's why we say we are Shaker. We need to live up to that in that area.
How do you anticipate change in the curriculum of classes where culture, history, and mainstream education is taught strictly about the Caucasian achievements in this country/world and emphasizes very little about the accomplishments of the African American achievements or of African American achievements? Will you welcome the opportunity for a better, positive understanding of African American people instead of just this, just being described in the context of slavery?
Mm-hmm. Again, and I think it's important that working with the chief academic officer to understand what the curriculum currently requires, but also what the state standards are. But again, as I said before, think beyond the possible, right? So there is information out there that we could include into the curriculum. The research that I've done in interaction with other teachers have said, in my experience is, I would love to integrate it, but I don't want to make a mistake. Because if I present it as a white male, and this is a faculty member at one of my institutions, is that if I say this as a white male, I'm not sure how they're going to take it. So we need to be able to recognize the identity of the teacher or administrator, as well as the composition of the class and the curriculum. and help them with the tools to say it's okay to be vulnerable. But you need to be able, and this goes for students too, we need to be able to be willing to learn more and understand why we're learning it. And the argument I hear all the time, and I tell people I don't buy it. What does learning about African American history, Latino, Asian American history has to do with science? I'm teaching chemistry. Why do I need to know that? There are not only white chemists. There are some very famous African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, LGBT chemists out there that have contributed a ton to the work we do. It's not watering down. And that is the term we hear a lot. And I heard it last week on television. We're watering down the curriculum. I disagree. We're not watering down the curriculum. Because at the end of the day, people want to be able to see themselves in the education and what they're learning. So what we can do is help identify those additional resources. Yes, and I give you an example. I was a substitute summer school teacher at Essex County College in North New Jersey. And they had no men of color teaching in this program. I was teaching biology. I don't know how that happened, but they said you're teaching biology. And the scary part is the textbooks that they wanted me to use were from 1987. And guess whose name was in the book? I got my aunt's textbook when she was in school. And we reviewed, and the other teacher and I reviewed that book, and we said, A, this is outdated. B, it doesn't capture the diversity of science today and the diversity of individuals. So we told them to use that book as a glossary, a dictionary for terms, but we were able to work and supplement what the North City School District wanted them to learn, but we put a cultural flair on it. Did it take away for the student learning? No. All those students passed summer school, pretty high grades. It didn't distract them at all. It didn't water it down. At the same time, as that teacher in the class, I learned something from those students. Because just because I was a Black male in the classroom doesn't mean I understand all African American history and experiences. And those students learned that. So there are things we can do to actually diversify the curriculum more, especially around women's issues. And I get the question, we look at it in a racial way, but we have to look at it from a gender aspect, socioeconomic, religious, because Shaker Heights is very rich in religious diversity, how that plays a role in the curriculum. So there are definitely ways we can look at that, but also the key thing is I would sit down with teachers in each building and just ask them through a workshop or program, you know, what does diversity mean to them? What does inclusion mean to them? What does equity? Because each building should have a focus that lines with the district's equity policy. So every day when we enter the building, the students, the principal, the administrators, the teachers, we know what our diversity inclusion statement is and how that aligns with our equity policy. And that connects to the curriculum. That connects to how we work with students around discipline. It works how we work around with students with just mentoring and advising. All our work needs to be pointed back to a central area. And the district has started that with the equity policy, but now we need to build more on that. So to answer that question, which I know is probably a long-winded answer to this, is it is complex, but we can do it as a district if we think beyond the possible.
All right, so we have about 9 minutes left. So we're gonna see how many questions we can get in our last 9 or 10 minutes here.
Sure.
Let's see. Who or what are your top 3 to 5 go-to experts or sources in terms of anti-racism and your equity philosophy?
That's a good question. as I stated, a lot of it is Daryl Sue, who did a lot of work in this area about multiculturalism. Damon Williams, who wrote the book of helping us understand what it means to be a true chief diversity officer. Doesn't matter if it's in higher education, but also K through 12, and making sure that I still work on possessing the characteristic and skills needed to be successful in this role, any role, and making sure that we're committed on creating and committing to change. The other areas, I really look at is, to be quite honest, there are a lot of scholars, but some of the people and experts I go to are some of my very own mentors in my life who have been doing this work for a very, very long time. John Wolfe, he is an African American PhD linguistics. He was the president of two historically Black colleges, and they brought him out of retirement to be the vice chancellor at the University System of Maryland. He has been very instrumental in helping me understand how to tie things together, but also as a sounding board. His work, and he's done this diversity and inclusion work for over 40 years. So I use him as a solid expert in going into that. The other piece, many people may look at me and go scholarly, but it's not really scholarly, is all of the colleagues I've worked with and the students, from elementary school to each college student I interact with, because all of the scholarly information that I can regurgitate to you right now to show you that I am well versed in diversity, inclusion, and equity, but they are the ones who really educate me on how I'm looking at this, because it's their experiences. So there are times I will sit down with a student and say, how are things going? This is an issue going on within our school. Help me understand how you're feeling. That helps me tie all of the literature that's out there together to help me fully understand how to address these issues. So you don't rely just on 4 or 5, because I can probably list 20 to 30 easily. But at the end of the day, the ones that I identified are critical into understanding how to be successful in my role.
Let's see. There are a lot of questions and not a lot of time. So I was trying to figure out if any of these, if I could choose something that kind of has a similar theme. Okay. What education will you put in place for students and staff to better the experience of minority students who are not African American? And this, I'm imagining, parent says, my son is a member of this group, sometimes referred to as a model minority, and it has become clear after 2 years in the district that he and our family require more formalized support to help him navigate racially fueled remarks.
So the one thing I think first I would do, what's at the end of the question? I'm sorry. Okay. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to do a climate survey of the district, especially in 9 through 12. As I stated through this process, there are some really great climate surveys that we can administer and follow that up with focus groups to really dig deep into that data of what our students are telling us, as well as teachers. The other piece of I was looking at too, how we get around this is, I don't know why many school districts have gone away from the summer reading programs. And I think that's the most critical piece that we can do and put in place. So over the summer, I would like to implement a series that students can sign up, and we will have them read 2-3 books. And it will be a summer seminar where we can talk about these difficult issues and how do you handle and address um, microaggressions, whether macroaggressions that you may experience in the classroom. So for example, we will hear certain things people say as, and I hear this still as an adult to this day, you speak so well. So how do you navigate that? By still understanding who you are and not having to satisfy that individual's thought that, wow, I'm shocked. And one of the ways is to help the student facilitate the conversation by saying, well, what made you want to ask me that question? I'm just curious from an educational standpoint. Because the one thing we fail to realize, sometimes our students come into systems where they're either the majority or the minority. So they're still trying to learn, right? And the one example I will give you, when I went to Washington College in Maryland, people still refer to Black people as people of color or colors, right? So to work with those students, I made sure I did an advising program with those students that once a month we talked about the potential micro and macroaggressions that they may experience, but also how to get allies. And when I mean allies, it is not, yes, I know I don't support discrimination, but I'm speaking out. No, what does it really mean to be an ally? And we can put a program in place to help students understand what it is to be an ally and a productive bystander. And this goes to the sexual misconduct pieces as well. So I think we have opportunities, but the summer program I would really love to do and make that into an opportunity that our students, even teachers and parents, will be willing to participate in and continue those dialogues through programs, but also action steps after.
So we just have a minute or two left. Knowing that the community is going to be taking the time to watch this interview, is there anything that I have not asked that you feel is important to share with the Shaker community?
Sure. I I want the Shaker community to know that I am very dedicated to this work. I've dedicated my life and my professional career to understanding diversity, inclusion, and equity, to make sure we can make changes, but also to make sure we create change agents within our system. And I am invested in this also not just because I live in Shaker and I have kids in the school system. I'm invested because any student in any school district will be a contributing member to our society. And I want to make sure that we are teaching them to be a well-rounded individual and understand it's okay to disagree and not agree on things, but it's what you do at the end to make this place a better learning area. So I just want Shaker to know, if I am given this job, I will work very hard and tirelessly to make sure I'm listening to all constituents and making sure I'm collaborative with the administration, the teachers, and the students, parents, and alum to make sure decisions are made that benefit the district.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us today, Dr. Parker.
And thank you for having me.
Wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. You too.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your being here. A couple of things before we jump in. I just want to thank everyone who took the time to submit questions and to share that we have more questions than we have minutes. And so you may hear what sounds like one of your questions. I tried to combine them based on themes and really get to the meat of what people were trying to ask, in hopes that we could get through as many questions as possible while still allowing Dr. Wilder to answer them to her satisfaction. So thank you, Dr. Wilder, for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So before we dig into the questions shared with us by the community, if you would tell us a little bit about your professional background and tell us why Shaker and why this role.
Okay, so I have just over 20 years of experience in education. I started out at Baldwin Wallace, used to be Baldwin Wallace College, but now Baldwin Wallace University, working in multicultural admissions, and then pivoted into Director of Multicultural Student Services. Left BW and left Cleveland in 2004 to move to very hot and sunny Florida to pursue my doctorate in sociology, and completed my doctorate in sociology in 2008 from University of Florida. Throughout my 4 years in my doctoral experience, I started teaching at the college level. I have been teaching at the college level for, hard to believe, 16 years at this point. After I completed my doctorate, I moved to Jacksonville, Florida to begin a faculty position at the University of North Florida. Stayed at UNF for 10 years and did a number of things while in my faculty role related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Also spent a lot of time being embedded in a Northeast Florida community and tried to do a number of things to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion practices there. I left UNF in my tenured faculty role in 2018 and currently work for the National Center for Women in Information Technology on the social science team as a senior research scientist. We work with a large number of organizations across the country who are interested in making the computing world more diverse. And so I do a number of programs related to work specifically with interface specifically with the K-12 Alliance, which is comprised of almost 500 different members, school districts, organizations, and anyone who has a vested interest in advancing equity within computing and computer science education. I am originally from Cleveland, grew up on Walden Avenue, right down the road from all of the Shaker schools. Went to Hathaway Brown School, really enjoyed it. And why Shaker? Of course, it would be great to come back home. And I think this role really does suit me very well because it's almost like a conglomerate of all the different experiences I've had. Of course, diversity, equity, inclusion, interfacing with K-12, and would really allow me to leverage my skill set to do some really important work. And this job seems like a great challenge, and I have never walked away from a challenge. And it seems like it would be a really great fit for my skill set and the work that I do.
Thank you. So I jump into our first question. What experience and practical strategies can you offer K-12 teachers to create more equitable lessons, equitable questioning techniques, equitable strategies for working with parents, and a more equitable lens for delivering pedagogy?
Okay, so as a teacher in the college space, I spent a lot of time working and interfacing with other teachers and spent a lot of time working with faculty and helping them to advance their pedagogical sort of framework, how they approach teaching, how they enjoy teaching. I also spent some time doing teacher training for K-12 teachers, specifically as it relates to equity and inclusion. I taught a course for teachers on diversity, so diversity for K-12 teachers, sort of creating and building foundational skill sets related to diversity and inclusion and offering practical strategies for how to incorporate that within their classroom experience, but more importantly, how to embed that in their sort of teaching philosophy, sort of thinking about how to develop equity at the core of your pedagogical approach is really, really important. And also, one of the areas that I've researched and published in is around teaching and learning. And so as a scholar of teaching and learning, it's really important for me to assist others to help build their curricular toolkit, if you will, as it relates to equity and inclusion. And I also have sat for a number of years as doctoral faculty for EDD students, for folks who are completing their educational doctorate, and helping them to build a skill set to directly impact the K-12 system.
Thank you. A director of equity and inclusion has to push us toward a world we've never seen, while bringing folks along who have different starting places. The path to success can feel quite narrow. What do you need from the community and leadership to create the space to have the tough conversations that cannot be had without discomfort?
You have to push through in doing this work. I have taught over 3,500 students over the course of my career. The bulk of my teaching courses that I've offered have focused on disrupting the narrative and making people feel very uncomfortable. And there really is an art to that. You have to be able to engage with individuals in a way that is going to disrupt their thinking, but with a purpose. And so what's needed in order to tackle those difficult conversations, you need to have alignment. I would argue that you don't necessarily need to have everyone in consensus as it relates to ideology, but consensus when it comes to the goals and the outcome. So in other words, I've been in a lot of experiences with students, for instance, in the classroom space who may not necessarily embody an anti-racist practice in their ideological mindset, but recognize the value in learning about that and thinking through how to employ that in the work that they do and in their everyday lives. And so while it may not necessarily be feasible or easy to get everyone to agree on perspective, there is a way to get folks to agree on the goal. And if we can get to a point of interest convergence where everyone is buying into the notion that, yes, equity is at the forefront of what we're doing in Shaker, it's important, it's radically important. Racial equity and racial justice needs to stand at the center of everything that's done at the district. If you can get folks to agree on that, then it is a little bit easier to create pathways to get to that point where you are tackling the conversations. I would also think that where we are as a nation is really primed for doing this work. So we're at a very uncomfortable spot in our nation right now. People don't necessarily agree politically. They have very different ideological perspectives at times. They have very different social locations and as far as like their position in the world and the space in which they occupy. But I do think that we're at a point right now in our nation of interest convergence. In spite of all of the differences, many of us agree that we need to change, that we need to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. And beyond talking, we need to get down to action. And so I think that is exactly where this position is and exactly how I would walk into the work, recognizing that we're all different. That's okay. But we need to get to a point where we all recognize and understand and are aligned with the notion that every student in Shaker, regardless of their background, what street they live on, or their zip code, every student going through Shaker through the K-12 system is doing that and walking through the school system, learning with equity and justice and fairness at the core.
Next question. Sexual misconduct among students creates significant barriers to equity and inclusion, especially but not solely for young women. From your experience in post-secondary and/or scholarly institutions, what would you say are your top 3 priorities for addressing this problem in Shaker?
So sexual misconduct is something that I have experienced personally as a student. It's something I've experienced as a professor. and also, sitting in my faculty roles, and something that I feel very strongly about. And I also think, tempered with the current movement around social justice, prior to that, we were talking a whole lot around the Me Too movement and looking at ways to advance equity for women and girls in particular. And so the three things that stand at the forefront of that is that, first of all, you cannot blame the victim. We need to recognize that the responsibility on changing the narrative does not fall on the student. So I'm a woman of color. I also study women of color, women and girls of color, and I recognize very readily that there is this narrative that's in place, particularly when it comes to Black and Latin girls, that girls of color are a little too fast, right? We've heard that before. We need to suspend that thought. And we need to suspend that narrative and take the blame off the victim and hold the system, the systems and policies and practice accountable. So the first thing is shifting the narrative off of the individual and moving it onto the culture. In this case, it would be the school district. Thinking about and working through training, because that's really, really important. Training, equipping teachers and other folks in the district on ways in which to readily identify bias and training related to sexual misconduct. A lot of that training also needs to go, needs to be extended to students as well, particularly in the middle and high school levels. And furthermore, there needs to be an accountability system in place as it relates to policy. So there are very tough measures in place to redress and address sexual misconduct and the practices from the perpetrators of that, so that they understand very, very well that, again, it's not the victim, and that folks will be held accountable for their actions, regardless if that's another student, other adult individuals, or anyone. And again, so also I want to point out here, and I know we've got other questions to get to, sexual misconduct runs a continuum. So it's not just someone having something physically happen to them, but this notion of feeling unsafe as a result of comments, various microaggressions. It's a variety of things. So it's important to sort of distill that with the foundational piece. When you disrupt the narrative and take it off of the individual and put the focus back on the system, you can pay attention to the wide range of things that fall within sexual misconduct.
In your experience, what is the most effective professional development strategy to disrupt the ongoing systemic/institutional racism in the pre-K-12 educational setting that addresses the implicit and explicit biases and lack of historical knowledge about the African American experience that many white educators bring into their classrooms and other interactions with Black students? If you need me to repeat any part of that question, that was a lot of question.
Yeah, I think I got the gist of it. To me, it's very simple. It's teacher training. And it's not just a one-off workshop. It is, from the beginning of the appointment of the teacher and the system. And let me just kind of put a pin in that for a second to say, we recognize, and I think this is where the question was getting to, we recognize that the vast majority of pre-K and early elementary educators, the vast majority of them are disproportionately white and disproportionately female. Okay, so we recognize that, which of course is why we are, the focus is ensuring that we get more educators of color, teaching in these fields. That makes a big difference. Before we get to that point, even if you say, for instance, have pre-K institutions and elementary education institutions with, let's say, 80% white female teachers, and it shouldn't just be on the teachers, it needs to be on all the teachers regardless of their race. There needs to be some training. I spent a lot of time over the course of my career developing, and as I mentioned before, teaching teachers about diversity, and there needs to be a part of professional development and training diversity training, and not just around foundational concepts related to equity and inclusion, or even things like implicit bias, which again, these are buzzwords that we hear, but a lot of times we don't really know what those things mean. There needs to be continued educational foundations for teachers. Once they start, for instance, if they transfer into the system, or if they're starting off as new teachers, that professional development is just as important as the other aspects of professional development, providing teachers with tools, first of all, to understand the history, the very specific history, and how a lot of our history is anti-Black. And let's just be honest, a lot of the history that we learn is anti-Black, anti-minority, but also very much anti-Black. To address that, provide them with the tools so they can understand the accurate history, recognize how important it would be, or what a misstep it would be if they don't focus in on, things like Black History Month. My daughter just finished the second grade, and I was very disappointed in, not only the teacher, but the system, and the lack of any type of attention toward Black History Month or programs or initiatives. And again, it's not just programs and initiatives and one-offs, but an entire professional development training for teachers so they recognize the distinctive history of Blacks in the United States, whether that is starting in the 1700s or even on into 2020. Continued professional development, and more importantly, that professional development needs to include some component of learning about oneself. And so when I say learning about oneself, it's not necessarily a psychological piece there, but the recognition that an individual has things like bias and privilege, and what that looks like in their day-to-day lives, and what exactly are they doing to perpetuate bias in their everyday lives as early elementary and pre-K teachers. And so that would require some deep learning, some long learning, some sustained learning, and there needs to be accountability built within that as well.
As a candidate for this position, how do you see systematic change in this district through education, sociological and administrative policies for minority students? And the example that they offer is the quick placement of minority students into individual education programs or being assigned an IEP.
Okay, if I could get the first part of that question again, I'm not really sure if I have a good context of what they're asking.
Sure. As a candidate for this position, how do you see systematic change in the district through education, sociological and administrative policies for minority students? And again, that example of minority students being placed on IEPs.
Okay, so I'm a sociologist by training, so I think that an important component of that obviously is research. And so as a social scientist, you have to be data driven by the work that you do. So one of the things that I had to do throughout the process of applying for this role was to develop a 90-day plan. So kind of outline the things that I would be attentive to in my first quarter in the role. And the very first thing that I wrote about was research. So it's important to get a lay of the land. And so if I could just drill down on that for a moment, that includes things like doing a landscape assessment, document analysis, and review. So if you're thinking, the person who posed this question is asking specifically about IEPs, looking at the data related to that, finding out more about the trends in that kind of data. I have a sense of where we think the trends would particularly be, right? Disproportionately, inequities as it relates to the Black students, particularly the Black male students. I would like to see that data disaggregated. But it's important to first use the research to identify trends and patterns in the data, and use the research to doing that with a racial and ethnic lens to look at where the disparities persisting, and then finding ways in which to address that. So You have to obviously go on more than just a hunch, but look at what the data is telling you over time as it relates to the number of students of color and the development of IEPs, and then thinking through ways in which to redress that inequity through the policy. So again, you know, I think it's important to point out that I think everyone recognizes that this particular role is very, very comprehensive. If I'm in the role, I would be sure that every decision that I'm making, every recommendation is going to be grounded within the research. And so part of that would be doing a snapshot and looking at and reviewing the data over the past 10 years as it relates to a wide variety of the metrics to see where the patterns are. Again, I think anecdotally we know, but until we really have you know, good explanations about what's going on. So a lot of that is going to be quantitative, like looking at the trends in the data, but then also qualitative, doing interviews, following up with teachers, doing observations, getting some data related to that. Then we can make some systemic change.
Thank you. Our diversity, equity, and inclusion work in Shaker is often centered on racial disparities. However, there are also income disparities that impact the student experience in our school system. Please address how socioeconomic disparities impact students and how teachers and staff can be trained to provide learning and services in a more equitable manner.
Sure. So as a sociologist and a Black woman, a woman of color, the way in which I approach all the work that I do is not just through a race lens, it's through an intersectional lens. The term of intersectionality is something that has become a little bit more widely talked about and used over the past few years. But when you're intersectional in your approach, you have to think about the ways in which things like race and class and gender and sexual identity and religion and ethnicity are tightly connected to an individual's experience. And so I would walk into this knowing that you cannot think about race without, of course, thinking about class, without, of course, thinking about gender, without, of course, thinking about ethnicity. So what you miss if you don't take an intersectional perspective, and I think this is where the person who posed the question is kind of getting to, what you miss when you say things like Black students. You miss the distinctive experiences of Black girls. You miss the distinctive experiences of middle class Black students compared to students who are from lower incomes. You miss the distinctive experience of students who aren't African American and who may perhaps have African or Caribbean heritages with them, which provides a very distinctive experience separate from the African American experience. And we could go on and on and on, right? So all of those intersections form what a lot of scholars call the matrix of oppression, right? So all of these different things create very distinctive and generate a fair amount of inequities for students of color. So that is how I would approach the work. So I've already talked about the importance of teacher training, right? So thinking about professional development activities for teachers that ground them, one, in the historical perspective of students of color, really the historical perspective of, you know, American minorities and you know, that particular experience. And that training would also be very much intersectional. So you have to think about providing tools and equipping teachers with toolkits for understanding that. And the work that I do currently, I spend a lot of time developing resources and curating tools for folks in the K-12 space. So things like, and I'll give an example, I created a resource on colorism and how we think about colorism, which is skin tone bias, right? And you can't think about the Black experience without looking at the ways in which having light skin or dark skin impacts educational outcomes, because the data tells us that it does. That darker skinned girls, for instance, are suspended more often, or are the subject of punitive measures in school more often than their lighter skinned counterparts. So that needs to be intersectional in nature, and that training has to be grounded within that.
Thank you. And this in some ways is along a similar vein. How do you anticipate change in the curriculum of classes where culture, history, and mainstream education are taught strictly about Caucasian achievements in this country/world and emphasizes very little about the accomplishments of African Americans? Will you welcome the opportunity for a better, positive understanding of African American people versus the slavery aspect of our people?
Absolutely. I think I'm a living, breathing example of that. I spent a lot of time in graduate school. I did my master's at Cleveland State, and I did my PhD at University of Florida, as I mentioned earlier. And I spent a lot of time in my master's program trying to convince my professors that Black scholars contributed to the discipline. And it's unfortunate that I had to struggle and fight with that because that wasn't the starting assumption. So it's the same thing that happens in the post-secondary space. People automatically assume that the folks making the contributions to our knowledge and what we know and how we teach and what we learn, it's automatically assumed that white folks are the ones who are the bearers of the legacy. And that couldn't be any further from the truth. I recognize that Black Americans have made valuable contributions to the K-12 space, also into the post-secondary space, and I spent a lot of time in graduate school fighting for that. Fortunately, I'm in a position now where I don't have to fight as much because we know now the importance of and the value of Black thinkers who had the misfortune of being born too early. So for instance, W.B. Du Bois and the contribution that W.B. Du Bois made in his writings at the turn of the 20th century really provide the foundations for American sociology. And he really was a pioneer of race in the US. Same with the folks like Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper, who provide the foundation for us now to say intersectionality. So, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in the 1990s, but she never would have been able to do so if it weren't for Anna Julia Cooper in 1892 and even Sojourner Truth in 1853 talking about asking the question, are a woman too, right? So they put through this notion of intersectionality. And I'm sorry, I completely got in teacher mode and away from answering the question. But yes, I would embrace the idea of, and probably go a lot more than embracing the idea of, the notion that we have something valuable to contribute, and that, again, that research, that landscape assessment would include going through the curriculum, getting an assessment of what's already out there, what's being offered, and making changes and shifts and adjustments to that. And it's not to say that we don't have lots of resources available to us. We have tons of things now in 2020 to equip teachers with the right ways to balance out the curriculum, if you will. There are tons of things that are available to teachers now to enable them to do that. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So really, there is no excuse for K-12 curriculum to not be as diverse and as balanced as history tells us it is.
Thank you. What training or education will you put in place for students and staff to better the experience of non-African American minority students? My son is a member of this group and is sometimes referred to as the model minority. And it has become clear after 2 years in the district that he and our family require more formalized support to help him navigate racially fueled remarks.
So again, that's the importance of intersectionality. When you think about race, again, without that intersectional perspective and without the important balance of history, history tells us that the experience of Asian Americans in a number of ways, particularly in the 1800s and early 1900s, is very similar to the experiences of African Americans and other Latin populations. They were part of the indentured servitude. Obviously, Blacks were the only group in the United States that went through institutionalized slavery, but really it was up until the 1960s where that narrative shifted in the 70s, where folks started to articulate this term of model minority. So I recognize that and understand the importance of showing that, again, the model minority, that's a myth, right? That's not true, but recognizing that that's the perception on students, particularly as it relates to achievement, high school level and the post-secondary level, and doing things to address that. And Erica, can you repeat the last part of the question again for me, please?
So the last part of the question was about supporting the student and the family, that they require more formalized support to help him navigate racially fueled remarks.
Sure. I would very much welcome the opportunity because I have taught young folks in this group for a really long time. I would welcome the opportunity of developing and teaching my own course, particularly at the high school level, honors course related to diversity and inclusion. If that's not something that's already a part of the curriculum, I would be more than happy to bring that into the role. And again, I know my role will be an administrator, but I've spent a lot of time teaching students and also, again, doing teacher training. So I think that's a big piece of it. Working with the student groups it's gonna be really, really important as well. And so I would definitely not shy away from that. But again, and I feel like I've kind of said that incorporate some aspect of training into every piece of my responses here thus far. But I do think, again, that training piece and the professional development piece is multi-pronged. It should be for students, it should be for teachers and administrators, it should also be for community members, for parents. So that piece should be customized to the various stakeholder, and of course that would look different depending upon if we're talking about students versus parents versus teachers.
Thank you. What will you do to build and strengthen relationships between families and school personnel, faculty, administration, and staff? And how do you see this impacting student achievement? Please give concrete examples of both a successful initiative that you have implemented and one that didn't work out as you intended.
Sure. So it is, the research shows us and has shown us for a really long time the critical importance of having parent buy-in and parent engagement, community buy-in, community engagement at high levels that directly impacts student achievement. We do know that. So we know that higher levels of family and community engagement will directly impact in a good way student outcomes. While I was a faculty member at the University of North Florida, part of my community work was working with the African American History Museum in Jacksonville. It's called the Ritz Theater Museum. I worked with the executive director there to create a curriculum for students that they were not getting in the schools. We developed a program called YBI, which stood for Young Black Intellectuals. It was a Saturday institute for students and their parents in grades 7 through 12. And every Saturday for the course that we ran an institute in the spring, the summer, and the fall. And so they run for maybe 12 weeks. And every Saturday we would bring in an expert in some aspect of African American history and culture to provide students with a counter narrative, if you will, to what they were receiving in school or what they weren't receiving in school. And the parents were very, very involved. a lot of the times it takes parent buy-in to get a student up in the morning on a Saturday to Saturday school from 9 a.m. to noon. And we didn't have any issues with any truancy or non-attendance. The students got there because the parents recognized how valuable something like this was. A lot of times as we progress from week to week, the students or the parents started showing up, and they stayed because they wanted to see and hear from the scholar or individual who was presenting for that particular week. It was a formalized program. The students had, we had textbooks for them. They had homework. They had to do a final project at the end. They had a formal graduation. And it was a really wonderful, rewarding experience for these students because they were finding themselves bought into something that they could connect to and resonate as far as the curriculum. And so that's a practical example of something that worked well. Unfortunately, I don't think I have an example of something that did not work so well within this particular context. It's not to say that the things that I've done have all worked wonderfully. That's not the case. But I don't have a specific example within this particular K-12 space to offer as something that was a misstep.
Do you want to perhaps give an example that was outside of K-12 to get to that?
Sure. Yeah, okay, this is easy. In 2014, I started work that would ultimately yield the only institute centered on race in the study of race in the Northeast area, Northeast Florida area, because I recognize now we're in Northeast Ohio. And so when you say Northeast, you need to be regionally specific because otherwise it gets taken out of context. But I was the founding director for the Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnic Relations at the University of North Florida, the only institute of its kind in the Southeast region, and also the only institute of its kind out of the 12 public universities in the state of Florida. We focused on research and looking at the value of research and trying to help us solve our community problems related to race. I would categorize that as a misstep only because, as the founding director, I did a number of things to build the capacity. And I think I did a really good job of building the capacity, getting the word out about the Institute. We hosted lectures. We had a number of different things that we did to have a digital presence and a social media presence and a digital footprint. But the one thing that we could not do, that I could not do successfully, was to create an environment in which the Institute would be sustainable, only because we did not have enough resources from within, and we did not have enough buy-in internally on the value of such an institute. So in other words, for this work to be successful, I mentioned earlier this notion of interest convergence. You need to get to that point where every entity, every stakeholder, whether that's a community member or a staff person, recognizes the value in doing this work. If you don't get to that point, you become under-resourced and sort of tokenized in a way in which people think, oh, that's just for folks who are interested in that race stuff or that Black stuff or that social justice stuff. Again, where we are as a society right now positions us quite well to make the case for race stuff to no longer be tokenized or canonized or marginalized to the side. We recognize now that this kind of work needs to be central to all of us for all of the work that we do. And so if given the opportunity to build the Race Institute again, I would work a lot harder on reaching that point of interest convergence.
Thank you. We have about 8 minutes left. So we'll see, maybe we can get through one more question and then leave a little bit of time at the end. let's see. What systems for accountability have you seen work or would you implement in a school district like Shaker Heights, where we know, and they put in quotations, white supremacy culture named in our strategic plan harms children of color in representation, in discipline, and in opportunities? This is especially challenging for parents and community members for whom see something, say something, has no consequence or follow-up.
Okay, these questions are like questions within questions. They're like nested questions.
Let me know if you need me to repeat anything.
I think I may have the gist of it, but I'll ask again if I need to. So people become a lot more responsible or strategic or thoughtful in their work when they recognize that they will be assessed and evaluated on said work. So if you put some type of diversity measure, and that's a very that's not specific enough, but if we're kind of just sort of speaking to answer this response, if you put some type of diversity measure in place, and let's just say something about balancing curricular activities or curricular things within, lesson plans, content, what have you. There is a careful balance of things that are more holistic that addresses all minority groups. And teachers then ultimately become evaluated on that, or if that becomes a part of their performance assessment, that's a way to hold folks accountable. Let me sort of also insert a caveat there to say, if you want diversity to be more at the forefront of curricular implementation and activity, and you're holding teachers accountable to do that, you need to give the teachers the tools in order to do that. You can't just say, go do that, and we're gonna hold you accountable for knowing this. They need to have the tools, and they need to be equipped in order to do that. So I think ensuring that individuals will be held accountable for certain things, typically you find success with that. Not in an antagonistic or contentious way, though. So you can't, present something in a way in which you're twisting someone's arm or forcing them into something. And when you usually say the word assessment, most teachers roll their eyes anyway, right? I know I did. It's kind of like, ugh, my gosh. But there needs to be higher levels of accountability. Again, it can't be something that, it has to be embedded in every single thing, right? So we're seeing this embedded within the strategic plan. That needs to be embedded within every piece of whatever teacher performances look like, principal performance, and every individual needs to be held accountable to this. I need to be held accountable to this. So if this is my job that I'm going into, then I need to be assessed to ensure that I'm doing that work to the level in which I said I'm doing it, right? And so I think when it becomes embedded into individuals, and this is just one way, when that becomes embedded into an individual's assessment or evaluation, then people are going to pay more attention to it.
So in our last few minutes, knowing that members of the community will be viewing this interview, what do you want the community to know that I have not asked already?
So I'll spend the time talking a little bit about my personal self. I love football, love the Browns. I've always loved the Browns like every other person. I'll share this really quick story. In the 5th grade, I got a chance to meet, now I'm dating myself, but people can look my age up, right? Okay. I got a chance to meet Bob Golick, and Ozzie Newsome came to my 5th grade class because we won some gridiron challenge, and I was 5th grade class president, and I lobbied for this because I've been a Browns fan since I was born, right? Also a huge football fan, huge college football fan. Unfortunately, Ohio State is not my team, so I know that might eliminate me, cancel me for a number of people. I went to University of Florida, so I'm a huge Gator fan. And, you know, I like the SEC. I have a daughter who, as I mentioned before, is heading into the 3rd grade. I am not the best cook. I love all things fashion and all stuff like that. And I'm a bibliophile. I have tons and tons and tons and tons of books, and I love reading and I love research, obviously. I consider myself to be a scholar at heart. And so any decision, anything that I do is going to be grounded within something that is going to be scholarly.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you.